get 8 hours in bed. I'm typically asleep for probably on average close to 7 of those hours. I usually still get up at about 6 a.m. That's my normal wake up time. Occasionally I'll sleep in till 7 a.m. I don't have any alarm that goes off Saturday morning. Even though I sleep pretty well on Friday nights, I must have a sleep deficit. And so by about 2:30 to 3 p.m. on Saturday afternoons, despite the best of my intentions, I just feel an overwhelming need to lie down and rest. And when I'm lucky, such as when my mind is going around about something, is operating on some question, is fascinated by something, needs to figure something out, then I don't sleep, and I may just lie down and rest for 15, 20 minutes, and I'll wake up refreshed, and I'll go back to reading. But typically, I fall asleep for about an hour on Saturday afternoons. Then I wake up groggy, because if you nap during the day for more than 20 minutes, you'll typically wake up groggy. And then I will not fall asleep until after midnight, typically. And so because I had that nap yesterday afternoon, I'd only got about 5 hours of sleep last night. And you can do many things to trick yourself. I had my weekly cup of coffee this morning, and I've got the energy from that, but you can't trick your voice, right? Your voice quite accurately displays your level of vitality. And I simply do not have the same vitality when I've had 5 hours of sleep as compared to 7 hours of sleep. And here's my second question for you. When you do something wrong, or when you suffer an injury, is your first response, this is my fault, I'm a bad person? Or is your visceral response, this is somebody else's fault, I'm the victim? So here's how it works for me. When my mistake is pointed out by somebody else and my well-being is in danger, my immediate instinct is to focus the blame on another party. But when I fall flat on my face, like I did Thursday afternoon, and no one else is pointing a finger at me, right? The only finger pointed at me is me, right? I landed on my middle finger of my left hand. Then my immediate tendency is this is 100% my fault. And I thought I slipped, I fell, and I keep doing this. Every few months, it feels like I fall flat on my face when I'm running along. I don't lift my feet up off the ground, and then I trip, and I always fall forwards, and I don't like it. It's embarrassing. And so I was just feeling out of sorts the past few days, and I think this is my fault. And then yesterday afternoon, I had the opportunity to revisit the place where I fell on Thursday, and there's a major dip. So in personal injury terms, if there is more than an inch displacement, say the concrete on a sidewalk or on a pedestrian path, there's more than an inch, then you have a case against the city or the county or whatever entity is responsible for keeping that up. And there was a substantial, probably 2 to 3 inch dip in the pedestrian crosswalk that I tripped on. And so in personal injury terms, this is a case of comparative negligence. So whenever there's a trip and fall case, it is always comparative negligence, because if you trip and fall, you always have some responsibility. And so typically it might be 50-50. And so in this case, it might be 50-50. If I had walked across the street, it's highly unlikely that I would have fallen. But I started running, and then I hit that dip, and there was about a 3-inch gap, and then I tripped and fell. Whew. So that brings up complex trauma. And the problem with certain terms is they get used so much that they cease having meaning. They become a cliche, and trauma is one of those terms that has become the go-to source for all pain and suffering and medical problems. Like it's trauma. But I started listening to this new guy, Tim Fletcher, new to me, and he talks about complex trauma, and it really speaks to me. So even though I don't like the term because it's so overused, but the idea is that obviously every child grows up with pain, but in approximately 2/3 of homes is relatively healthy, and the child can express what's going on and find a way to be authentic, true, honest about what's going on and get some degree of support around him. But for about a third of homes, including the various places that I grew up, it was not a safe place to be authentic and honest. And so I learned to adopt personae. And I adopt a personae when I do this show. I've steadily tilted since COVID towards the personae of regional Australia, outback Australia bloke. Just a simple bloke from outback Australia living in the big city. And that's a comfortable personae. And I learned to adopt personae from a very early age because that was safe. That was a way that I could navigate life and reduce my chances of getting hit. Up until age 11, I got hit quite a bit, right? I was bounced off the walls routinely. And to this day, I will jump if someone comes up from behind me or taps me on the shoulder or if there's any loud sound. I just jump, not like the Van Halen song, not in an exuberant manner, but I am just like scared to death, just scared out of my wits. And to deal with my chronic reflexes of shame and fear and fright, right? I developed various personae to just try to navigate a challenging, difficult world where it's not safe to be honest. And I was trying to think as I was listening to Tim Fletcher talk with Theo Von this morning. I was thinking, at what age was I able to be consistently emotionally authentic? So I did develop a good friend about age 7. So there was some degree of emotional openness there. But I don't think it was until I discovered Air Supply that I found a place where my authentic, most genuine, my deepest, my strongest, most compelling feelings were authenticated. Right? It was listening to Air Supply in 1980, early 1980, at the age of 13. So if I have any degree of sanity, it is the recognition that what I'm doing right now, sharing opinions and discussions on hot button, shameful topics, and I develop a persona to do this and to make it as safe for me as possible, because I recognize the dangers of what I do. But this is a persona. Some of the most precious, holiest parts of my life I do not discuss. And it's just easier to put something of a shield on. And I just like that persona of the Outback Aussie. And to the extent that this show has a unique selling proposition, it is that in large part, I understand the world around me through the prism of my own humiliation, shame, and failure. I recognize the humiliations that I have suffered through pursuing various strategies of dealing in an unsafe world. And then I kind of recognize those patterns in the larger world around me. For example, Donald Trump grew up with a brother, Fred, who was an alcoholic. And one of the things that I learned in the 12-step program, Anon, is to learn where I end and other people begin. When I began regular psychotherapy in something like April or May of 1998, one of the first things that my therapist talked to me about was boundaries. I did not have clear boundaries. So I was frequently intruding on other people's boundaries and allowing other people to intrude on mine. And I needed to learn boundaries. And boundaries, like so much else, I've discovered to my chagrin, and not something that I can adopt through a force of will. They were much more a consequence of learning to, gosh, this sounds incredibly gay, but to accept myself. And when I learned to accept myself, accept my own flaws, and to have a more accurate understanding of myself and my own drives and my own predilections and compulsions, then I was able to extend the same empathy for others. And then boundaries naturally developed as I developed more respect for my own choices and my own behavior. I was not able to unilaterally, through a force of will and rationality, develop good boundaries. I became aware of them through my therapist's instruction. I became aware of them through handouts that my therapist gave me, but I wasn't able to implement them as a direct act of will. They were much more of a consequence. So that's why I have great skepticism towards the modern Enlightenment perspective that through the use of our own rationality, we can develop a strategic path through life, that we can determine right and wrong, and that we are primarily individuals. That is the buffered understanding of the self, that we have this buffered rational capability that enables us to decide right and wrong, meaning and purpose and autonomous direction for our lives. Instead, I have the much more traditional, porous understanding of the self, that I am profoundly affected by my community, by the people that I'm around, by the posters that are on my wall, by the music that I listen to, by the books that I read. And so because I understand myself as porous, I try to use as much discretion as possible in surrounding myself with situations that will play much more to my strengths than situations that will open me up to my self-defeating tendencies. So Donald Trump grew up with a father who was brutal, and with an older brother, Fred, who couldn't handle the father's brutality and developed a drinking addiction. And so I'm not sure that Donald Trump ever went to Al-Anon meetings, but I think he developed a sense of there are certain things in life that are under our control, all sorts of things that are out of our control, and sometimes you have to allow other entities to reap the consequences of their actions. And so Trump is wrong when he says that Ukraine started the war, right? Just on an objective empirical perspective, right, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. But Trump is right to the extent that Ukraine wanted to ally with the West. It wanted to join NATO. It wanted to side with Russia's enemies. And so it produced a set of incentives that would overwhelmingly cause any neighbor like a Russia next to Ukraine to be overwhelmingly incentivized to attack and wreck Ukraine in retaliation for Ukraine siding with its enemies. Right? If you are a neighbor to a superpower, you don't get to decide your own foreign policy. Just as an employee, you don't get total autonomy with your life, even off the job. Right? You can make all sorts of choices off your job that will imperil your job and will likely increase the odds of you getting fired. In addition, while you are at work, you are perhaps, I find this a useful perspective. You may not find this a useful perspective, but it speaks to me. You are a type of slave when you're at work, right? You are there to be the instrument of your employer. And so if your employer tells you to do X and you don't want to do X, if you want to keep your job, you need to do X. You need to do what you were told. You need to adopt your employer's priorities. And if you don't adopt the priorities of your supervisor and of your employer, right, you're probably not long for your job. You have to subordinate yourself to your employer. And that's part of the reason why work is so helpful, even if you're, say, a contractor as opposed to an employee. While you are working, you have to put the needs of other people ahead of your own. And I've never been married. I've never had kids. I've often been accused of being highly selfish. So it's good for me in my self-centeredness and my selfishness and my narcissism for approximately 40 plus hours a week, because in addition to working, I also volunteer up to 15 hours a week. When I volunteer, I also put other people's needs ahead of my own. And that's healthy. And so I think Trump recognizes that Ukraine wrecked itself through its choices. And I wonder if Trump, influenced by the experience of having an older brother who is an alcoholic, if that helped him to recognize that when other people make incredibly self-destructive choices, sometimes you're not doing them any favors by stepping in and trying to mitigate the pain that they will unnecessarily encounter. My father, for example, would often try to steer me straight. And upon reflection, he was far more often right than wrong in this regard. But then I would stubbornly resist my father's direction, and he would get this countenance filled with pain, and he would shake his head, and he would say, "You will only learn through pain," because I wouldn't learn through advice. And so if other people are doing stupid things, other entities are doing stupid things, right? If your employer is doing stupid things, right, you will likely have to pay the price for his stupidity, just as a citizen of a state will have to pay the price of the stupidity of its leaders. and Ukraine will inevitably have to pay the price for its stupidity in trying to ally with the enemies of Russia while it is existing on the border of Russia. And so, in an objective, morally objective perspective, it doesn't feel right that nation states don't get to choose their own foreign policy when they border with a power that's much stronger than them. But that is the nature of reality. In an objective sense, it may not be right that an employee is essentially a slave for his 40 hours a week, but that is the nature of reality. In an objective perspective, it's not right that even how you spend your off-duty time can have a profound effect on whether or not you retain your job, but that is the nature of reality. When you join a community or when you connect with other people and form relationships, that will always come at a reduction in your freedom. And that may not feel right, but that is the nature of reality. And so I'm all about understanding reality, even when it doesn't accord with what I want. I quite enjoyed Friday's All In podcast. It's got the title here, Trump Rally or Scott Bessent Put. Elon Musk back at Tesla. Google's Gemini problem. Here we go.
Here we go. Yeah, I'm curious. I want to get your take on all this stuff because I'm fascinated by what's going on in these markets this week. Let's start on the markets because we got a rally. The question I think behind the rally is this a Bessent put? Is this a Jake?
Okay, so this is Andrew Ross Sorkin, New York Times columnist and a TV host on CNBC. Guy center left.
Powell's in the job. He's got a put on this thing. I don't know what you think is going on. We're up 3 to 7% for the week. There's been a she loves me not situation with what Trump's been saying about China and whether there's a deal or not a deal. China's saying nobody's talking. He says everybody's talking. What do you guys think is really happening? And then we got to get into Alphabet. We got Tesla, got a lot of earnings here that's also moving this around.
I think that the most important piece of financial logic that we have to break is this idea that there is always a put. The put is this weird thing, just for the folks that don't understand it, is that when the market goes down, somebody can bellyache and cry, and somebody in the government will say, okay, we'll buy your shitty securities at your bad prices. So that's what the put is. So typically what's happened is you can cry to the White House and they'll call the Federal Reserve and they will buy it. That's the Fed put. And in some very rare cases, when things get really calamitous, like in 2008, Treasury will set up a program and start to buy things. That's what was called TARP back in the GFC. So the question is there a put here? I mean, my honest answer is no. And the simple reason is, if you look at where we are, the stock market's back to where we were in like May or August of last year. And if you had said that we would have upended 50 years of economic policy and the markets would only be off 500 or 600 basis points, I would have been shocked. So there's no reason for a put. Maybe the more interesting question is, who's asking for the put? The ones that have suffered from the volatility. And a lot of those are the active market traders. So if you trace the feedback, who has been the most negative? Ackman's been negative. Ken Griffin recently turned negative. And that probably comes from the fact that they're not monetizing the vol the way that they used to monetize the vol, more than the market has speared down to such a degree that the world is coming to an end, because it isn't.
Okay, Zach.
Can I build on that? So
please.
There was a tweet 2 weeks ago when all this started by Nick Carter that I retweeted because I thought it was really interesting, which was, if you think a market sell-off delegitimizes Trump's presidency, you're going to give him unconditional credit when it rallies, right? Because those are the rules now. And that's exactly what's happened, is that the market has rallied. Like you said, it's up 7% this week, but the media doesn't want to give Trump any credit for it. So it's kind of created this narrative of a Bessent put. In other words, Bessent is entirely responsible for it. Look, Scott is a very smart man. He understands markets. He understands the bond markets, and he is a reassuring voice to those markets. And I think he's doing a great job. But I think part of what's going on with this Bessent put narrative is that no one ever wants to give Trump or his administration as a whole credit. So what they do in any particular week is valorize a particular member of the administration that they can then say, well, this is the person who's really responsible for this, not Trump, because they don't want to give Trump that credit. Next week, they'll be tearing Scott down, and there'll be some other member of the administration they'll be trying to valorize to basically prevent the administration as a whole from getting credit for doing something good. So again, I think Scott's doing a great job. I think he's doing a great job making these deals, and he's saying a lot of correct and reassuring things to the markets. But I think if the media is going to tear Trump down every time the market goes down, you have to give him credit when the market goes back up. And I think there's just a general reluctance to do that.
Where do you land, Dave?
I think that is he crazy enough to let it all fall apart? Signal that kind of got wiped out this week. That's really what it was. It was the fact that everyone realized that Bessent, Trump are not going to let trade come to a standstill. They're not going to let the whole global economy grind to a halt, that they're going to have to do something. And I think that the read is that they're making the indications that they're going to get deals done, which means that their intention is to make sure that the market doesn't tank. And
But
more importantly,
Dave,
that the
3 weeks
economy
ago,
doesn't tank.
roughly 3 weeks ago, when we started talking about this, I think I made the point, Chamath made the point, that part of the art of the deal here, so to speak, is an opening salvo,
Right.
which is bold, and some people would say maybe it's too extreme, but it's basically an opening bid to shift the conversation completely.
Yeah.
And that would create tremendous leverage to get deals done. And isn't that exactly what's happened? Isn't that the way it's played out?
Yeah, I remember there was a guy from Harvard who used to teach a class on negotiation. He put out all these videos, and what he always said is like, set your anchor point as far away as you possibly can if you want to get maximal leverage in a negotiation. I don't know what's farther away than 145% tariff. So it's clearly, a point for, as Zach said, for negotiating to a deal that seems like one that would have been impossible or implausible if you started from a 0% tariff beginning point in negotiating.
So there are many, I think, legitimate criticisms of Donald Trump, but one that I hear often that I don't believe stands up, and that is that Trump is stupid. Right? Trump is not stupid. There's no evidence that Trump has a low IQ. Right? He's not stupid. Now, many of the arguments made for Trump are not terribly compelling also, and that's picked up by the Financial Times in a column here by Jemima Kelly, Trump and the Art of Dealism. His acolytes discovering that it's not so much about any particular policy as having blind faith in the man himself, right? So we constantly hear, oh, this is all the art of the deal. So I think this is a solid critique. In Trump's mode of thinking, the means, right, can be as outlandish or unrealistic as he likes, because they're all justified by the ends, which are all about winning. And so the means do not have to be taken too seriously. Where I would differ with Donald Trump is that sometimes the means are more important than the ends, right? Shine on, shine off. Remember the Karate Kid? He initially goes to learn under the direction of a master, and the master simply puts him to work applying wax to a car, and the kid gets annoyed with this after a few hours as he's applying the wax. He says, well, what the hell does this have to do with learning karate? And finally, the master teaches him wax on, wax off, right? These are moves that you'll need to learn in karate. So sometimes the means are more important than the ends. Sometimes the ends are more important than the means. So anyone who says that the means are always more important than the ends, obviously that's not correct. I mean, do I have to back up that point? If your life is at stake, your friend's life is at stake, if lives are at stake, then the means to save those lives are usually far less important than the end result. On the other hand, we live in a confusing world that's much more complicated than we can possibly understand. Often the best we can do is to operate on the basis of solid, legitimate means. And for example, when I was running across the street, if I had not been lost in thought, I probably would have paid more attention to the uneven pavement, and I would have been less likely to fall. I would have paid more attention to the car park that I was crossing and whether any car was coming out that could hit me. Luckily, the driver of the car that was coming out was an elderly Asian lady who I suspect of all demographic groups is the least reckless with driving. So the Trump team has this attitude that means do not need to be taken seriously, and that's off-putting, and that's weird, and it's often wrong, right? It's going to be disorienting for normies to deal with. And Trump supporters will always be coming out with policies, ideas, and arguments on the hoof, and have a whole army of zealots ready to defend them as part of some grand plan that this is, Donald Trump playing 4D chess. And we've got Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent bending over backwards to justify Trump's tariffs as the strategy all along. He's going back and forth. So what's this belief system that Trump's faithful disciples have created and now subscribe to that treats his book, The Art of the Deal, as evidence that Trump is the savior of America? And one way of describing it is dealism. And the great thing about dealism, but also its great flaw, is that it can never be wrong. Right? It is utterly bulletproof because it's never clear how far into the game of four-dimensional chess we are. Telling lies, flip-flopping, making a huge mess, or just part of the process. And it's not so much about any particular policy, right? It's about having blind faith in the infallible master dealmaker, Donald Trump. And yeah, this does sound like a cult. And yes, charismatic leadership does tend to end badly. right? What is charismatic leadership? Someone emerges who does something that seemingly impossible and gains a following. And then he keeps doing things that appear seemingly impossible, which Donald Trump has done. But eventually, you don't get to continue on this path, right? Eventually, you fail and you fall on your face. And so Donald Trump says the real excitement is in playing the game. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about what I should have done differently. So yeah, there is this element of nihilism with Donald Trump that can be quite disconcerting. Now, have you detected a change in the discussion about Trump's tariffs? Because I sure have, right? We seem to be talking much less about whether or not Trump's tariffs are a good idea or whether tariffs are a good idea, right? We seem to be talking much more now about how tariffs are implemented. And Grok agrees with me. Says you're picking up on a shift in the tariff debate. Initially, much of the discourse framed tariffs as broadly harmful, disrupting trade, raising consumer prices, risking retaliation. Now there's a much more nuanced critique emerging, particularly around Donald Trump's approach. So now much of the discussion is about Trump's tariff strategy. Is he too aggressive, too unilateral? Does he lack a clear focus, right? For example, imposing broad tariffs on allies and rivals alike, will that not strain diplomatic ties, invite a stronger pushback? Why not targeted tariffs aimed at specific industries or at countries like China? Is there a cohesive plan to offset what's going to happen as a result of these tariffs? What are we going to do with regard to higher consumer prices or supply chain disruptions? So there seems to be a pivot in our public discussion with regard to tariffs. So are you seeing this too? Am I just the only one picking up on it? But Trump does seem to have a unique ability to focus the attention of the American elite. And so sometimes it was with regard to immigration, sometimes it was with regard to Islamic immigration, sometimes it was with regard to building the wall. Now it's with regard to tariffs. And the Trump bump in news revenues is pretty much related to how much the news organization focuses on Donald Trump. The New York Times and the Washington Post back in Trump's first term focused a great deal on Donald Trump, and they saw an enormous rise in traffic and in subscriptions, while newspapers like the Los Angeles Times, who did not focus so much on Donald Trump, they did not see that huge growth in traffic and subscribers. So this is the Trump bump that's available to news outlets that focus on Donald Trump and what he's talking about. So yeah, the broader news discussion, policy discussion, elite discussion has shifted from opposing tariffs generally to critiquing Trump's specific approach, right? The focus now is on the implementation of tariffs. The approach now seems to take it as inevitable that we are shifting towards a different American economy. We're shifting towards a more protectionist trade strategy and how we can navigate this new economy. So we have a much more nuanced debate than we did in the initial reaction to Trump's Liberation Day. So back to the All In podcast.
And there was some percentage of the market or some probability that people were assigning to the fact that this administration could be crazy enough to tank the global economy by leaving tariffs really high and letting this kind of run. And I think that that's kind of being taken out of the market.
Right, but now that it's out of the market, that means that the leverage, there's less leverage. There's less leverage in the conversation. And if the goal is to...
No, that's not true. That you're saying a critical thing, and that is not true.
Well, hold on. If the goal is to effectively pressure China, which I think is the ultimate goal, I think as the bond market has spoken, and as Trump and Bessent administration has said, okay, we understand where the floor is here, what we got to do. I assume if you're Mark Carney, if you're the EU, name your place, India, Japan, you say, I'll make a deal with you. But if you thought I was giving you the world before, no. You need me as much as I need you, and you seemingly need me even more now.
So the part where I agree with you is that last part. Like, I think too many times you look at the stock market and you think that that's reflective of what's actually happening. And it's not. The stock market, I think the best way to think about it is it's an estimation of what the future would look like at a rate of return. You're superimposing a view on reality. So what is actual reality right now is if the United States was running negative $2 billion a day of trade deficits, right? If our current account balance was minus $2 billion on March 31st, the day before Liberation Day, the real question is, what is that number mathematically after April 1st, right? Because you're ratcheting up tariffs, okay? And you're implementing a scheme that should take that negative $2 billion that's going out the door, out of America's shores. It would have.
Okay, let's have a look at the change in the general narrative, right, with regard to tariffs, right? This is not just something in my imagination, right? So we had an article in NPR, April 11, Trump's tariffs a bargaining chip for a new global economic order, right? Trump's tariffs are now seen as part of a broader strategy to restructure the global economic system. It seems to me that our discussion has made a substantial shift, right? There seems to be broad and bipartisan support for a change in the global economic order, something equivalent to Bretton Woods, or equivalent to Richard Nixon taking the United States off the gold standard in the early 1970s, right? So the shift in the elite media has gone from opposing tariffs to understanding the strategic use of tariffs, right? They're no longer viewed solely as a blunt instrument. Now they're also understood as a tool for negotiation. We had a New York Times article, April 10, 2025. Trump's tariff reversal calms some GOP nerves, but questions linger, right? So Democrats are outraged. Republicans are caught between opposing tariffs, fearing criticism of Trump. But we've got a more nuanced discussion here where the focus is on Trump's specific policies rather than just tariffs in general. And political reactions are now playing a significant role. We have commentary from the Los Angeles Times, April 11. No one understands Trump's thinking on tariffs. Here are the top guesses, right? So there's confusion, there's speculation surrounding Trump's tariff policies. Trump has been making abrupt reversals, leading to mixed reactions. Some see these reversals as strategic. Others doubt its coherence. And I don't agree with Michael, who was on the show about 10 days ago, who thought that Trump's reversals discredit tariffs as a policy, given that every medium to large-sized country has become rich only through using protectionist measures. I don't think that, given that all the examples we have of medium to big-sized countries becoming rich, it's through using tariffs. I don't think that Trump's tariff reversals discredit the policy, right? We don't have any examples of medium to large-sized countries becoming rich through free trade. No country becomes rich through consuming. And then we've got various economic analyses. We've got the Penn-Wharton budget model on April 10 titled The Economic Effects of Trump's Tariffs, right? They underscore the significant costs of Trump's tariffs, their projections, the economic burden. The shift has moved towards evaluating the effectiveness and the necessity of Trump's tariff policies. Then we have discussions of how Trump's tariffs fit into larger economic and geopolitical strategies. So we've got a speech by Stephen Moran, who is the head of Trump's economic advisors. Says that tariffs are part of a plan for a Mar-a-Lago Accord to devalue the dollar, reduce trade deficits, and that there's a strategy beyond mere opposition to the conventional wisdom. We've got Trump's threats, such as a 100% tariff on countries abandoning the dollar as a reserve currency. We've got more nuanced discussion about how Trump is reacting to economic pressures. So Donald Trump is the most powerful person in the world. And I think many people would disagree with that. But even Donald Trump has to operate within particular situations. And when you have rising bond yields and falling stock market prices, all right, when we see a global shift away from American assets, right, that raises alarms of a potential financial crisis. And so in the face of that, Donald Trump retreated, which I think was a good idea, right? Paying close attention to the bond market might be even more important than paying close attention to the stock market. And now 10-year bonds have shifted from above 4.5% before Trump began his climb downs to now they are below 4.3%.
Flipped it positive. How positive? We don't know, but I'm sure that the government knows, and I'm sure the White House knows what that number is. That's important fact number one. And then separately, the country that matters the most on the other side of that, who was very positive, right? Let's say China was plus 3 or 4 billion a day. Where did they go to? And I suspect that it's probably break even or possibly even negative. So if you think about what the new reality is today, April 25th, as we tape the show, we've gone from -2 to maybe +1, and China's gone from plus 4 billion a day to maybe 0 or -1. And I think that's what instills the leverage that is required to get the deal done. Then we can all debate whether the forward PE of the S&P should be 16 times or 22 times.
So my word for today's show is complex. I want to talk about complex trauma, and I want to talk about complex variables and expertise. So the more variables you have, right, the less compelling is the case for particular experts. For example, with regard to global trade, there are just so many variables. For example, there are national defense considerations. There are national cohesion considerations. There are alliance considerations, right? There are just so many variables beyond one or two, which shifts the realm of valid expertise away dominantly from economics, because there are also political and defense and social considerations. And so given the number of variables with regard to global trade, I'm not sure that we can accord any individual great expertise. There's just too many variables for any individual to master. So Nathan Kofnas presented the challenge to me: you're defying knowledge when you disagree with the experts, because the dominant view of economists is that tariffs are a bad policy. One response that I have to that is that there are too many variables in global trade to accord economists that much deference, right? No individual can master all the variables. Therefore, we don't have to be as subservient to their expertise as we might be if they are truly expert, if they truly mastered the topic. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about professional ethics. So the main ethical obligations of a doctor are to his patient, right? That ethical obligation just overwhelms all other obligations. The major ethical obligation for an accountant and an attorney is to their client. Now, consider, however, journalistic professional ethical obligations. The journalist has obligations to the reader, to the subscriber, to his bosses and superiors, so to his organization, to the subjects that he is writing about, to the individuals he's writing about, to the people that he interviews, to his sources, and to his profession. Right? The ethical obligations of the journalist are so varied that they tend to reduce the power of professional ethical obligations. They just don't seem nearly as clear and as forthright as they are in the case of the attorney, the accountant, the dentist, or the doctor, right? Where there's just one party to whom you primarily have ethical obligations. The journalist has ethical obligations to his reader, to his organization, to his profession, to his subject, to his sources, right? His ethical obligations are so incredibly diffused that his ethical obligations are not nearly as clear. They are just spread out to so many different entities that they are not as immediately compelling as they are for the normal professions. And so too, think about expertise with regard to world trade, right? You not only have to take into account the effect of world trade on, say, consumer prices within your country, but you also have to take into account what will be the broader effect of trade deficits or trade surpluses, what will be the effect on your alliances, what will be the effect on your workforce, what will be the effect on your national cohesion, what will be the effect, say, on average and below average IQ members of your population and their ability to work and earn a decent living, right? There are just a lot of factors that you have to take into consideration. So let's get Michael back onto the show. Michael, what's going on, man?
4D, how are you?
I'm good, bro. Good to talk to you.
Yeah. So here's the deal. I do not think that the trade tariffs have been delegitimized as a concept. I just think that we're kind of never going to know how they would transpire if you had like really large tariffs. And so I heard Dan Turrentine on Two Way.
Yes.
Speaking of Two Way, I think you turned me onto that show, by the way. But which I love. I listen to that every day. I don't know if I ever told you that. But what he said is that now we're not going to see the structural changes which the big tariffs promised. So I still believe in tariffs as a concept. I think it would have worked, but I do not believe that we're going to see manufacturing come back to the United States as people would understand that idea, because now it's turned into just like a beef with China that we have 125% tariff on China. So first, the point was we need to bring manufacturing back. Now the point is just China is bad. We need to mess with them. So it seems to me like the goalposts have shifted, and maybe, as you say, there's reasons why Trump backed down from them, and maybe those were reasonable. So I find it disappointing, but it doesn't really affect my life personally. So I'm ready to just move on if this is how it's going to be.
Okay, here's one rebuttal to that perspective, and it comes from 12-step programs. There's a saying there, you can save your face or you can save your butt. And it's more important to save your butt than to save your face. And so it appears on the surface that Trump is saving his butt and saving America's economy by backing down, because the overwhelming reaction from the bond market and the stock market and the falling value of the dollar, that all these things happen together, it seemed to create a state of crisis. And so there's something more important than being right, and that's saving your ass. And so Trump backing down, and so that we no longer get as clear and definitive a result, I think it's less important that we get clarity on the result of substantial tariffs. It's less important that Trump looks good. It's less important that Trump is consistent. It's less important that a certain ideology is given a thorough test than navigating an incredibly complex world in a way that protects the best interests of Americans. So would you not agree that more important than ideological considerations and partisan considerations is the best interest of Americans?
Yeah, I do. And like I said, I'm willing to accept that perhaps that was the case, just all things considered, it was not worth kind of going down on the ship of putting high tariffs on everyone. So I think we can agree on that. I don't think we disagree on the issue at all, actually. So I don't see any disagreement here.
Yeah, and then I have a follow-up, which is related. There's a concept in California driving laws, don't be dead right. So don't insist on the right of way. And I remember one time I blew through a red light at like 70 miles an hour. And if the opposing traffic had insisted on the right of way, I'd be dead and they'd be dead. And so even if Trump is right, but due to factors outside of his control, right, he is going to lose badly even though he's right. I think don't be dead right is a terrific principle in life, right? There are very few principles that you can pretty much always follow, but this might be one of those rare principles that you can always follow. Don't be dead right? Don't insist, even though you're right, if the results are going to be terrible for you and for those that you care about. And what do you think of that as one of those rare principles that you can pretty much always follow?
Yeah, I like that. I think in previously I've been guilty of being dead right, and like you kind of go on a moral crusade against your own self-interest, and you just have to say, hey, the world is an imperfect place and people are corrupt, and you just have to take things as they are and just move on.
I was reading, because my economics background is in the free market, Adam Smith, University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, UCLA approach. So everything that I've learned about economics has been on the case of free trade. But to try to balance that, I just read Robert Lighthouse's book, and he was Donald Trump's trade representative during the first term. And Lighthouse is not a free trader. He's not automatically against it either, but he's kind of in the middle. He sees a substantial case for protection for some industries. And he made the point that he was able to work quite effectively with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, because they too were very much interested in the well-being of America's manufacturing base and the well-being of America's manufacturing workers. And one of the reasons that Donald Trump won his 2 presidential elections is that he was able to get the votes of people who wanted more protection, who wanted more manufacturing jobs. And even if one, say, despises protectionism, and even if one, for example, despises the Maha movement, despises its rejection of medical expertise, even if one despises Robert Kennedy as head of Health and Human Services, the way that you win elections is by expanding your coalition. And if Trump is able to bring on lefties like Batya Ungar Sargon, who's a Marxist and a lefty, but she's on board with MAGA because she sees it as operating in the best interests of Americans. And so even if one ideologically does not like Trump's tariffs, if you overall support Donald Trump, then perhaps you can give him a break in that you can understand he only won election by promising more protection and more concern for America's manufacturing base and America's workers. Any thoughts?
Yeah, let me tie that to even the Russia-Ukraine situation, or war, I should say, which is that I heard you discussing earlier, people are pissed that Trump said that Ukraine started the war. It's kind of funny. You know, he has a way of saying things in a very concise and provocative way. And the kind of low IQ media response is like, oh, but actually, like, Russia invaded. So how can you say that? I heard Sean Spicer talking about that again on Two Way. And he's like, man, if I could talk to the president, I'd say, don't say that Ukraine started it, but talk about, you know, like, give a softer version of that. And I thought, that's why Sean Spicer, I like Sean Spicer, but that's why you were not a good spokesman for Trump, because you don't actually share his beliefs, at least not on Russia and a variety.
That's true. Yes.
A variety of other issues. So Sean Spicer, as press secretary, always tried to package Trump's views in a way that's like, actually, this is just normal Republican stuff. You in the media are exaggerating. So he had totally the wrong narrative and the wrong lens for presenting Trump's ideas. Even though, again, he is like, comes off like a cool guy, and I can say that because I listen to him every day. As I said, with Mark Halperin, they have a good dynamic going. It's not quite as good as Luke Ford, Michael M. vlog, but you know, they're getting there.
Yeah, and you're touching on something there that important, that Sean Spicer comes from Republican Incorporated, right? He's a right down the middle member of the Republican Party. He's also largely aligned with National Review type conservative, and so he will try to soften Trump's harder edges to make them more aligned with mainstream Republican Party attitudes and with mainstream American conservatism. And Donald Trump mounted a hostile takeover of the Republican Party and then of the United States of America. And so I think you're picking up on something good. I don't want to run away from tariffs just yet. What do you think about the idea that Trump has this unique ability to dominate a conversation? And so we have talked about tariffs at an elite level over the past month since Liberation Day. than more than any other time in my lifetime. Like Trump has exerted a force field of attention so that tariffs has become pretty much the number one talking point for the past month. And Trump has a unique ability to do that. And those news organizations that ride the Trump train, right, they are able to pick up an enormous amount of traffic and subscribers by riding the Trump train, just giving him tremendous attention, while those news organizations that don't focus on Trump, they don't tend to pick up a lot of traffic and subscribers. So do you have any thoughts on what I just brought up?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, but if I can focus on the media point you just made, a lot of websites that started as a kind of splashy, oh my God, here's a new pro-Trump website. It's not National Review. It's cool. It's populist. But they ultimately converge towards the same thing. Like they would actually be against tariffs. They would actually be, pro-Ukraine. They would actually be still mongering war against Russia and Iran. I've seen that process repeat. One of which I'll call out is American Greatness. Didn't that website come out, and weren't you kind of like excited? This is a cool new.
Yes, but it very quickly turned against Trump. Like in 2017, it turned against Trump.
I wasn't aware that it explicitly turned against Trump. I just noticed that. I just find it to be just GOP Inc., as he put it. It's not fresh. It's not new. And it's the same thing. It's neocon. It's conventional thinking. It's not fun. It's not different. I could name other, like you could even say that about, I don't want to call out people by name because I don't want to alienate myself from like every single conservative media, but I don't know, maybe you have.
Yeah, I got some thoughts. So Julius Krein is the main intellectual behind American Greatness. And this project started with a bunch of intellectuals wanting to make the case for Trumpism in early 2016. So it was Julius Krein and Michael Anton writing under pseudonyms on I think a Blogger account. And then one of the articles that gained attention was the Flight 93 election, where Michael Anton likened the 2016 election to Flight 93 on 9/11, where the passengers stormed the cockpit because they saw they had no other choice. And eventually the intellectuals behind the nascent American Greatness were outed. Michael Anton went on to work for the first Trump administration. He's now working for the second Trump administration. Julius Krein went on to explicitly found this online magazine, American Greatness, that was initially developed to make the intellectual case for Trumpism. But then Julius Krein, like Ann Coulter, very quickly became disillusioned with Trump. And here's something that I've noticed. And that is, whenever you ask more from a friendship or a political commitment or any kind of relationship, even if it's a virtual relationship between a political supporter and a president of the United States, whenever you ask more from that than it can give you, you will be disappointed and you will feel betrayed and you'll likely lash out. And so this happens again and again and again. And I didn't ask more from Trump than he could deliver. I simply expected Trump in his first term that he'd make some progress towards reducing immigration. And while I was overall disappointed with his first 3 years, by the time 2020 rolled around, he crushed immigration. And so I was very pleasantly surprised by the results in his final year. And elsewhere, he made a little bit of progress towards the things that he campaigned on. So I was never disillusioned by Trump until after the 2020 election, when I hated the way that he tried to discredit the election results and how that led to January 6th. But people like Ann Coulter and Julius Krein, they put more weight, more belief than was rational on Trump. And so they became disillusioned and became feeling betrayed, and then they lashed out. So have you noticed this tendency where people put too great an expectation on a relationship, even a relationship with, say, Donald Trump, and then they turn bitterly against him?
I mean, just speaking specifically to those cases, it was just bizarre for Ann Coulter, even just as a career trajectory, to be anti-Trump. It was like, who is your audience? But she's really come around now that once again, she's one of the most articulate spokesmen for conservatism or Trumpism. She's really one of the best. She seems to just have a breadth of knowledge that is very impressive. I think she was a lawyer, and she had a background working under a Republican administration, I think Reagan, or so. She's no dummy. But some people go against Trump. I think in her case it was like an ego thing, like he didn't follow what she said specifically. So I think that some commentators get caught up in their own hype. They believe their own hype, and then it's a way of saying I'm powerful, so don't slight me, or else I'll go against you, and then you're in trouble. It's like, but you are a commentator, cannot be bigger than the movement itself, so it doesn't even make sense. But there's a lot of people.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge, because this is the through line that I notice with most commentators, and this is where I deliberately try to steer against this, and that is the upshot of almost all pundit commentary is to place the pundit at the very center of things. And so if you're saying that America is on the edge, on the ledge of descending into communism or fascism, right? You're saying that the end is nigh, and therefore there's nothing more important. If the end is nigh, nothing is more important than the end is nigh. And because you are able to see that when most people don't, that then places you in an attitude of premium importance. And so it's discouraging, and I think it robs the credibility of pundits when that seems to be the upshot of everything that they're saying, is to try to advance their own status. And yeah, you do see that with these pundits who soured on Trump. And it also touches on a second important topic, and that is individual and his freedom to say the truth as he sees it, and then your responsibilities to the community. And so Amy Wax took Nathan Kofnas and Richard Hanania to task, because both Kofnas and Hanania have been overwhelmingly negative about the second Trump administration. And Amy's saying, you're not making my job easier, or those of us who support a conservative or right-wing approach to politics, when all you do is dump on Trump. And you've got to consider that Trump is going up against almost all of America's institutions, which are dominantly controlled by the left. And so he has an enormously difficult task. And you may make many valid criticisms of that, but you're lacking the perspective. And so you're only focusing on what Trump is doing right. And so I recognize the individual wanting to be 100% true to his perception of the truth. But also there is a case to be made for taking into consideration the effect of your words, and the effect of Kofnas and Hanania on people who take them seriously is demoralizing. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't really know who Hanania's audience would be. He definitely has an audience, so he has a bigger audience than me, so I don't want to, that's not like a cheap shot, but he's a very eccentric guy with eccentric views, and like we said last time, I think it's kind of a status signal for him. I think for Kofnas, he just genuinely doesn't like Trump. I mean, he's a professor, and you'll have a hard time finding university professors who favor Trump. But on the topic of conservative media, for 1 second, Trump said something like, "Russia, stop," and it was the headline on the New York Post, and actually even on the whole media. Like, they loved that headline, that Trump said something confrontational towards Russia, and they hyped it up towards 1,000. And then kind of the next day, Trump's like, well, no, I don't think, Russia's okay. They're trying to end the war. So it wasn't quite what they wanted to make it out to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a fascinating time to be alive. And here's one challenge that I'm wrestling with that Nathan Kofnas posed to me. He said there's virtual unanimity among economic experts that Trump's tariff plans are a disaster. How can you oppose that? And I don't have one clear response, but I have a small response, and that is some topics contain too many variables for any discipline to be able to credibly claim expertise. And so I think we all know that economists' predictions about the overall national economy are quite mixed. They're not terribly impressive. They don't earn the respect that science has earned, because economists predicting the future with so many variables that will influence the national economy, that their record is quite mixed. So too with climate change and forecasting the climate, the record of experts there is quite mixed, because no individual can credibly claim to be an expert in international trade, because there are just so many damn variables. There are the variables on prices for consumers. There are the variables on the effect on a nation's workforce. There are national security implications. There are national cohesion implications. There are alliance considerations. There is international balance of power politics considerations. So I do not give economists, even trade economists, deference as the definitive experts on international trade, because there are just way too many variables outside of the realm of economics to accord them status as experts. So too with regard to climate change, there are so many variables with regard to climate that no individual scientist can possibly have expertise in the arena of climate. And so you're therefore, you don't get the deference of science, because you are confounded by far more variables than you can possibly master. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree in regards to trade. Like, you would have to literally just try tariffs. There's no study that could prove it one way or the other. Climate change, I'm a little bit more deferential towards the experts, actually, at least as far as they can say that we've seen the temperature rise, and then we've like found a parallel with the rise of CO2. So that to me seems like something you can kind of verify a little bit more easily. And so even though it's kind of rare for someone in the conservative space to say what I said, but I've just never really been persuaded by the conservative raging against climate change. I heard kind of a transition here. I heard Jordan Peterson talking about that. He's very skeptical of the climate change narrative, but he was on Joe Rogan. I don't know if you caught that. And I was thinking, like, Jordan Peterson is a guru, and I've never heard Luke Ford talk about Jordan Peterson. So what do you think about him?
I've talked about him a bit. He's never held my attention. I did watch one documentary about him, but listening to him has always made me uncomfortable. And I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but I just feel like I'm listening to someone who's just so mentally ill that it's just uncomfortable for me to listen to him. And so I think that Jordan Peterson makes many good points, but he's just too mentally disturbed for me to listen to for very long. And I think while he can be a useful guide for some people in certain situations, overall, he's deserving of a great deal of skepticism, and particularly when he plays the outraged pundit. I don't have any time. And when he claims, I've read 300 books on global warming and I know therefore it's a hoax, I don't buy that. I don't buy his claims outside of his expertise. I've never been a Jordan Peterson devotee. I just always felt profoundly uncomfortable listening to him, because I couldn't name it at first, but as the years went by, I could name it as just such a high level of mental illness that seems to be operating there. Any reaction?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I want to use the term mental illness. That's funny, but he does get a little weepy sometimes, and people make fun of him for it. I don't want to make fun of him he's an emotional guy. He's like an artist, you know, he's like maybe a little bipolar. Well, I guess that would be mental illness. But he tends to tear up sometimes, but he's passionate. And nor am I a devotee to Jordan Peterson, by the way. But I think I respect him. And I bring him up because you hear he's like a very polarizing figure. So a lot of people on the far right like hate him for reasons other than what you said. And then some people love him, and then liberals hate him. But to me, I just kind of feel like, yeah, I respect Jordan Peterson. I think his way to becoming famous was kind of a heroic thing. Like he refused to say the pronouns and he took personal consequences. I don't think he did that as like a publicity stunt. He was just a professor, right? He was an academic. I read 12 Rules of Life and I thought it was good. Unfortunately, I can't find it, but I remember enjoying it and finding it like challenging but engaging. Someone gave it to me. Like a challenging book that connected biblical stories to kind of almost self-help or just self-improvement kind of approaches to life. Someone gave me his latest book, We Who Wrestle with God, and I think it should be called We Who Wrestle with This Book. It's like a very challenging book, let me say. But I don't find it to be a ridiculous book. It's a very serious effort. And now I know Luke Ford is going to say he's not a biblical scholar because he doesn't speak Greek or Hebrew, to my knowledge, but he does engage in a very serious and earnest examination with the Old Testament and the New Testament. So again, I don't necessarily find him to be like a pretentious guy. I think he is a very smart guy, and a lot of what he says is very speculative, but I think it's legitimate.
Okay, here's one strong critique that I've heard of Jordan Peterson that I would also apply to Dennis Prager, and that is they've each created a religion of one. Jordan Peterson's Christianity is not recognizable to any Christian denomination. Jordan Peterson is bored out of his mind at a typical religious service, but Jordan Peterson many years ago dreamed of setting up his own church so that he could preach. And Dennis Prager is similar. Like, he's bored out of his mind at a normal Jewish religious service, but he likes preaching. And so Dennis Prager's older brother, who's an Orthodox Jew, tells Dennis quite accurately, your Judaism is a religion of one. And Jordan Peterson's Christianity is also a religion of one. So for each guy, their religion is not recognizable to any denomination within their religion. And so I have some skepticism towards people who use religion for what seems to be self-aggrandizement, right? Both Prager and Peterson want to use their respective religion as an opportunity to preach to the world.
Well, that is definitely impugning his motives. I mean, he's not like I don't even think he's a Christian, but I don't care because I'm not either. So I think that he is genuinely interested in the Bible and the stories of the Bible. And you can't deny that. I challenge you or your listeners or anyone to pick up this book, We Who Wrestle with God, and you won't doubt his knowledge or at least interest in the Bible. But like, I don't think he believes in God, to my knowledge. So, but to me, I'm kind of the same. Like, I find the Bible very interesting, but I don't literally, believe in like the miracles or in Christianity. But I think for him, a lot of his audience, probably most of his audience, actually are Christians. So he's kind of, I can just say that bluntly because I don't care, but he is probably walking a fine line because he doesn't want to alienate people. So he's just kind of vaguely like talking about Christianity without actually being Christian.
Right. He wants the benefits of Christianity without paying the price of Christianity. And so you don't have to be an adherent to Christianity to recognize the difference between a Christian and someone who is trying to seize the advantages of Christianity without paying the price of being a Christian. And so this also would apply to Nick Fuentes, right? He recognizes that being public about being a white nationalist is just a loser, but if he wraps himself in Christianity and says, I'm Christian first, I wrap myself in the blood of Jesus Christ, that is much more palatable way to present himself. And yet when I listen to Nick Fuentes, I never hear any sacrifice that he makes for Christianity. And if you are going to claim the protection of Christianity, if you want to claim the benefits of Christianity, if you want to speak on behalf of Christianity, then if you're not paying the price for that, then it strikes me in Christian terms as cheap grace, right? It sets off my skepticism, and so it's fine. Don't be a Christian, or be clear that you're not a Christian. But Jordan wants all the benefits of aligning himself with Christians without being honest that he is not a Christian.
Yeah, I think he's just ambiguous about it. I don't see it as dishonest, but he doesn't profess to be a believer unless I'm missing something. But he knows more about the Bible than 99% of Christians. I have no doubt. But so I'm not seeing the hypocrisy. But again, the thing is that if you're a conservative, like 99% of your audience are Christian, right? So that's why I would never be like a good face of conservatism. Because I don't check the right boxes. And so he's an intellectual, and his audience is conservatives, and he's talking about Christianity, and he sees a lot of benefit of it. He interprets the stories of the Bible in almost like a psychological way. Something he said on Joe Rogan was that the sacrifice of Jesus represents the sacrifice you have to make in your own psyche of one part you must sacrifice to become a unified whole. Like I said, it's very speculative. It's not like true or false, but that's kind of what he does. Like, he comes up with a secular interpretation of the Bible. His takeaway is not, and that's why you must follow God. His takeaway is more like, and here's the moral lesson that you can take away from the story in the Old Testament.
So it doesn't trouble you that he's not more explicit. So, for example, Donald Trump wants the support of Christians. His biggest support base is evangelical Christianity. But Donald Trump doesn't do much to claim he's a Christian, right? He will do a little bit here and there, but Donald Trump is the most carnal, sinful, post-Christian American president that I can imagine. But he explicitly says, with me in the office of the presidency, Christianity will have power. But he's, I don't know, I just find him much more forthright about his transactional approach to Christianity, while Jordan Peterson seems to play down the obvious fact he's not a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, point taken. I don't 100% agree, but I will say, final thought, I challenge anyone to try to read his new book. I'm not saying it's bad, but I think I've spent about an hour or maybe an hour and a half reading it, and I'm not even past the intro. So I'm starting to doubt whether anyone in America has actually read it. I think a lot of people probably bought it, but there's probably about a dozen people that have read it cover to cover. So
yeah, it's like Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. The first third is just compelling, fantastic read, but the last 2/3 is a real slog. But do you have 1 more minute? I want to lay something out for you.
I love Closing of the American Mind, by the way. I didn't find that a difficult read. I've read that several times.
The last 2/3 you didn't find a difficult read?
The discussion of Nietzsche and Plato. No, I mean, it was definitely less concrete than the first part. But I love Alan Bloom, the legacy of Alan Bloom. Ravelstein is a book, kind of fictionalized version by Saul Bellow, which is about Alan Bloom. So that's another one for people to check out.
Okay, I got one more thing for you, if I can hold you for another minute.
Sure.
Who determines the winning narrative? So, for example, it seemed like in the first few weeks of the second Trump administration that Trump was determining the narrative, and then the last 6 weeks, the narrative has gotten out of his hands. And so I think it's worth asking, how do you control a narrative? So I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal column here. The president has lost control of the narrative, but he has a chance to retake it. So my fundamental question is, who determines the dominant narrative? And my answer is the dominant determine the dominant narrative. And even though Trump is portrayed as a bully, the narrative is primarily determined by the dominant in our society, and the dominant are those who control our institutions, particularly our institutions who dominate narratives such as cultural institutions and media institutions, which are dominantly in the hands of the left. Do you have any thoughts on who determines the dominant narrative?
I certainly don't have any answers to that. And in fact, I find it kind of a mystery because the way that people kind of ignore or follow the manufactured opinion through the media is mysterious to me, because apparently the dominant narrative was controlled by Trump in order to win the election, but now supposedly his approval rating is going down because now the narrative is people are listening to what the media says. And I know you would say people are not gullible, but it seems like sometimes they are. So I can't solve that one for you. Sorry, 40.
Okay. Thanks, bro. Good to talk
All right.
to you.
Take care.
Okay, so my answer to the question that Michael just raised is that people are not gullible with regard to things that are vitally in their interest. And given the consequences of tariff policy are not going to be vital to most people because there's nothing they can do about it. And so even if something is vital to you, but there's nothing you can do about it, there's no rational reason where you should be invested in determining the truth of something. So when I say people did not evolve to be gullible, it is people did not evolve to be gullible with regard to that which is vital to their interests and that to which they have substantial effect. Right? If something's vital to your interests, but you have no power over it, then that is not what I'm talking about. And so with regard to tariff policy, 99.999% of Americans have no influence on America's tariff policy. Therefore, they are not rationally incentivized to delve deeply into it. So in areas where you're not rationally incentivized to take a strong stand, in that, right, there is no evolutionary reason why you should not be gullible, right? If you can't affect political and international outcomes, there's no rational reason why you should be terribly invested.
I don't think that matters, but the actual cash flows have materially changed.
By the way, I think long term, America's got leverage here. Everybody wants to invest, is ultimately going to want to invest in America, including China. There's no question that we have the advantage on a long-term basis. The question is, do we have the patience?
Well, if you go from -2 to plus,
given our democracy, given our bond market, given everything that goes on, we're such an ADD society.
Okay, then then what I would say, Andrew, I think that's a very good point. What I would say to that is, then we need to communicate better. It needs to be a single point that's repeated by everybody in the cabinet. And what they should probably focus on is, hey guys, we just flipped cash flow. We went from negative cash flow to positive cash flow. Here are the actual numbers. And don't deviate from that, because then I think Americans would say, hey, this thing is working. Let's let it play out, to your point.
Hey, Sachs, here's my question for you. So we hear, the president say he's talking to President Xi. We hear Scott Bessent say that he's in talks with China, or that the talks are going to begin. And then you hear China say, no, we're not talking. There's no talks happening. We don't know what you're talking about. Stop saying these things. What are we all supposed to believe?
Well, look, first of all, let me just say that when I'm on this show and I'm not talking about AI or crypto, I'm just a civilian, right? So I'm not a spokesman for the administration. Rare earths. So there was some good stories in the New York Times about this over the past couple of weeks, which I think were largely accurate. China identified this as a critical industry, and the rare earths, the ore itself is distributed all over the world. I mean, China has some advantages there, but they're not huge. It's the processing of the rare earths that's very expensive, very complicated, and they decide to dominate that industry. And they're responsible today for over 90% of the processing of rare earths. And then the next step in the supply chain is that those rare earths get cast into rare earth magnets, which are a critical component in pretty much every electric motor. And so they're a critical component of the automotive industry, but not just cars, lots of different products. And I think China makes something like over 90% of the cast rare earth magnets. Well, by the way, this issue still has not been resolved. China has now cut off the United States. And so as part of this trade negotiation, we're going to have to, resolve that issue. And I trust that it will be. I mean, what you've heard from the president and the Treasury sector over the past week is that they've indicated a desire to engage in bilateral negotiations with China and to essentially de-escalate this trade war. But I think it's been very useful, again, as a stress test to reveal our critical dependencies on China that we've exposed. We never should have let this happen. Just from a national security standpoint, we worshipped at the altar of this free trade god to the point where we became dependent on China for these critical components in our supply chain. I think that was a catastrophic mistake. And I think that it's exposed these dependencies we've created on a nation that is not our ally and that we can't count on them. It's a country of concern. So I ultimately think that we're going to need to learn from this experience and very rapidly make some major corrections here.
Andrew, let me just highlight what I think is one oft not talked about point about the discussions that are underway. There's a lot of conversations about tariffs and about trade deficits, but very little about regulatory parity. And I think that this is really critical for these trade negotiations to actually resolve to a positive outcome for American businesses and American enterprises, because there is not parity in how American businesses can do their work overseas relative to how foreign companies can do work in the US. So if you're an Indian company and you want to sell something in the US, you set up an LLC, you set up a bank account, you set up a store, you take a lease, and you sell your product. There is not a lot of hoops and challenges to that business operating in the United States. I'll tell you a story. In 2005, 2006, Monsanto, which was a seed company that doesn't exist anymore, launched in India cotton seed for cotton farmers that basically had a trait in it that would prevent worms from eating the cotton. And so Indian farmers were paying 450 rupees an acre for cotton seed before. Monsanto basically put this cotton seed, the yields went through the roof. The farmers made 5,000 rupees per acre of incremental profit, and they charged 1,500 or 1,400 rupees per acre for the seed. So it was more expensive seed, but it had a 5,000 profit improvement. And it took off, took the whole market. 90% of farmers bought the seed, not because they had to, but because it was better. And what ended up happening was the Indian government stepped in and said, you got to lower prices. You got to go back to the price of 450 because that's what's fair for farmers. And the farmers were like, we're doing great. We don't need to have this kind of price control. But the government put price control in and ultimately sued the company, went to court, and stole their IP, and they left the country. And this was a company that had invested, well over $1 billion in developing and launching this product. The same is true, by the way, in pharmaceutical companies, in software companies, and hardware companies. If you want to go do business in China today, you have to set up a 51% JV where some local company owns 51% of your equity and your IP. The stories around the world, I think, start to paint a picture of why American businesses find it so hard to develop international markets and sell into those countries, when in the US, we make it so easy for companies based in foreign countries to come and sell in America. And that's a big part of where the trade imbalances arise from. It's not just because Vietnamese people can't afford expensive American goods. It's because it's so much more regulatorily difficult to do work in these countries. They can come in and take your IP. And so I think that this is like a really important part of the trade.
So I asked Grok the other day, how do you succeed as a live streamer? And one of his points was to pay attention to the audience. So let's have a look at the audience on X right now. So I'm going out live simultaneously on 6 platforms, on YouTube, on X, on Rumble, on Odyssey, on Facebook, and on Kick. Got to fire up Kick in my browser. So Kick was started by Australians. It's funded by gambling ads, but let's have a look here at the comments on X by Kip. Good news is the US dollar has bested all currencies in the last 10 years. That's not necessarily good news. It's good news for some people. It's bad news for other Americans. It's not necessarily good news for America that the American dollar is so strong. It hurts American exports and it helps imports into America. The bad news is de-dollarization is a real thing. Well, it's not necessarily bad news. It depends to the extent of de-dollarization. So you can hold dollars for investment reasons, or you can simply maintain dollars to do deals. And most deals in the world are done with dollars. And that's still true, but we do seem to have a shift away from holding American dollars for investment. So Kip says the de-dollarization movement has accelerated since we used the SWIFT system to steal from Russia, and BRICS, the countries like Brazil, have mushroomed since that boneheaded move. Trump is trying to leverage America's monopsony, meaning America's dominance, by getting better deals through tariffs. Yes, I think that's true. If you devalue a currency too much, nobody will want it. Tariffs are rapidly de-industrializing the United States. Trump is attacking all allies, then trying to isolate China. It's more evidence that he is stupid, whether it's low IQ or due to dementia. All right, there are very substantial grounds to criticize Trump's tariff moves. Even if you support tariffs, you can say he's doing them badly, that he's doing them too suddenly, that he's not doing it in a coordinated way with allies to try to isolate China. Japan, for example, is not going to sign any kind of trade deal that impinges on its ability to make trade deals with China. America was deindustrialized once we allow China to join the WTO in 2001 as a most favored nation. So manufacturing jobs went from 17.2 million in 2000 to under 11 million by 2012. Typo Fan says Americans are extraordinarily spoiled and it may be our undoing. Well, you can point out ways that Americans are spoiled, and you can point out many ways that Americans are not spoiled. Americans are about the hardest working advanced economy in the world and pretty close to the most productive. So people overseas notice vast American wealth. What they often don't realize is how hard Americans have to work for that wealth. In Australia, everybody gets a minimum of 4 weeks off a year, right? There are no minimum vacation days for most American workers, or for a large number of American workers. It's all in the negotiation between the worker and the employer usually has the strong hand. Hopefully Donald Trump will be overthrown this summer once we have mass unemployment and empty shelves, plus people's student loans going to collections. Right? I don't think that's going to happen. China and Mexico, says Kip, are able to pencil whip their way out of tariffs, but manufacturing 99% of a widget, then shipping it to Mexico adds 1% to the widget, then ships it to America as a product of Mexico and therefore gets to avoid tariffs. That's something that the Trump administration cracked down on in its first term by renegotiating NAFTA, and its intent on keeping a lid on this is huge. So the reason that Trump has unilaterally employed tariffs all over the world, including on an island where there are only penguins, is to head off this type of situation. So you just can't say, hey, this widget comes from Lesotho or some island only filled with penguins, to try to avoid Trump tariffs. That's why they were employed universally. And so the news media and the elites just had derision for the universal nature of Trump's tariffs, but there may have been some strong arguments in favor of it. People are paying attention to tariffs because they threaten to destroy the U.S. power and influence and to wreck our economy. Yes, I agree. That's a large part of the reason people are paying attention to tariffs. Lord, protect our moral leader from the perils of uneven sidewalks. Protect our moral leader from his grandiosity that causes him to stop paying attention to the uneven sidewalks and the challenge they present, because he's so lost in thinking about all the amusing things he's about to say on a live stream. Elliot Blatt, looking at the YouTube chat. Do you notice how pervasive trauma talk has become? Yeah, it's become incredibly pervasive over the past 10 years. It's become the answer to all ills, and that has been incredibly discrediting. Bob says, my dishwasher wouldn't work this weekend. I had to wash dishes by hand, a humbling experience. Bob adds, my read of The Art of the Deal is that Trump explicitly tells us he just wants to make deals. It's not like he's hiding this. Jane Jacobs argues that regional monetary policy is the key to thriving economies. Almost everyone is focused on tariffs, much less on monetary policies. One of the possible goals of this administration is devaluing the dollar. This gets less attention. Have tariffs been prominent as a tax since the West got the income tax? Not generally. Do most people understand that the US dollar as the world currency gives the US government an incredible advantage? Yes, it does give it an incredible advantage, but it also imposes incredible disadvantages. Have you heard any news about Gunt? What's his real name? A lot of speculation that Ethan Ralph is dead. I don't know if that's true. Bob Outberger makes a great point. Jordan Peterson never gets to the point. He is an enterprise. Not sure if his business or his ideas are more important. Well, neither. It's not his business. It's not his ideas. What's primarily important to Jordan Peterson is attention. Right? He is primarily competing in the attention economy. I saw the Jordan Peterson interview of Peter Thiel. Peter prevented Jordan interrupting him several times. Quite funny. Peter knew how to handle Jordan's personality and silence him. It's like Peter was quite well prepared. He knew what he wanted out of the interview. He steered it to his liking. This is another great point by Bob. One function of books is to have it on your table as a conversation starter when you have people over. Yeah, particularly women. Right? It's often awkward the first time you have a woman over to your place, and given that I only date women who read books, it eases the conversation. When I have lots of books around, it opens up conversation. Someone like Jordan Peterson makes YouTube videos they will then make a point about grabbing your book and asking you about it. It's a better conversation than talking about the weather. The domestic regulatory regime in many foreign nations is a major barrier to establish a foothold in foreign nations, more impactful than tariffs. Yes, true. European grocery stores have discovered it's impossible for them to establish themselves in the Norwegian market because of Norwegian regulations.
Trade discussions and negotiations that a lot of people miss, that American businesses will see massive revenue growth and massive market adoption if we can get regulatory parity in some of these key trade
Okay,
deals.
let me ask you a different question. Chamath raised the issue of Ken Griffin, who made some comments this week about the brand that is America, and effectively said there was sort of a sell America situation going on.
So I give Aaron Ross Sorkin for being so relaxed and so congenial and fitting into the ethos of this podcast, as opposed to Larry Summers, who was so angry when he appeared a couple of weeks ago.
And my question about the brand that is America is whether you think after these tariff, whatever deals get done, that you can put the toothpaste back in the tube, that you can get the trust back, that there's not going to still be some kind of toothpaste on the rim of the tube that you can't stick back. It gets all nasty and crusty, right? That to me is a fundamental question. I want to read to you what Ken had to say. I think Ken was probably a bit of a reluctant Trumper the second term, but nonetheless, he's been outspoken on a couple of things. He says, if you think of your behavior as a consumer, how many times do you buy a product with a brand on it because you trust that brand? In the financial markets, no brand compares to the brand of the U.S. Treasuries, the strength of the U.S. dollar, the strength, the creditworthiness of U.S. Treasuries. No brand comes close. We put that brand at risk. What say you?
Well, look, I think there's a fundamental question here about whether you think there's a problem with the status quo or not. Ken Griffin is one of the biggest winners in our economy under the current status quo, and I don't think he sees a big problem that needs to get fixed. But I think
Right, a strong dollar is good for some parts of America, but it is bad for American manufacturers and those whose livelihood and well-being is affected by the strength of American manufacturing. A strong American dollar is good for American consumers in that they get to buy cheap products from overseas. It's also good for overseas nations shipping goods to the United States. So there are winners and losers from free trade, as there are winners and losers from tariffs, right? It's not like America as a whole is clearly winning or losing from having a strong dollar. So this is the question I put into Grok this morning. There are just too many variables with global trade for anyone to be an expert. There are too many variables with global trade for any one academic discipline to be able to claim expertise. So I am more respectful of expertise than populists in general, than Trumpists and MAGA. I am less respectful of expertise than the elite consensus. So one difference between elite opinion and regular American opinion is that elites are much more deferential to expertise. So I'm right in the middle between experts and populists. And it's not enough just to have expert opinion, right? To me, that is just the beginning of the discussion. All right, we have experts at the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. They tell us that about 36,000 Americans die of pneumonia each year. So to me, that's just the beginning. I don't automatically discount that or accept it. I don't automatically venerate it or despise it. I want to know, how was this number arrived at? And the answer is it was arrived at by guesswork, initially with regard to pushing the yearly flu shot. It's not based on death certificates, so it's not nearly as significant as the CDC releasing numbers of Americans who die from COVID. Right, that number comes from a death certificate, right? A physician, someone with expertise, decided that this person died of COVID. Now, there's a populist challenge. What's the difference between people who die of COVID and people who die with COVID? And it sounds like a smart challenge, but it falls apart upon analysis because the average length of time between contracting COVID and dying from COVID is 14 days. So when someone's had a health condition for many decades and then they die of COVID, I think it's fair to say they died of COVID, right? They were obese for 40 years. they had pre-diabetes or diabetes for 25 years, and then they catch COVID and they die within 2 weeks, they died of COVID. They died from COVID. They didn't just die with COVID. People who died of COVID, from COVID, overly died of COVID, not just dying with COVID. So it's important to delve into the claims of experts. So we're told, for example, about inflation numbers. And so I don't automatically respect inflation numbers, and I don't automatically reject inflation numbers or numbers with regard to unemployment. I want to understand how they arrived at. And when there is a substantial discrepancy between popular opinion and expert opinion, then I don't automatically side with the experts and side with the people. I want to go deeper. So I want to place myself in the middle. And that's where we had this thoughtful Politico article. The voters were right about the economy. The experts were wrong, right? Unemployment in the United States is far higher. Wages are far lower. Growth is less robust. And inflation is much higher as regards to regular Americans than government statistics and experts suggest. So one of the main critiques of Donald Trump's trade policy is that the American economy is doing great. We have record low unemployment, and we're on a great trajectory. Now Trump is messing things up. But are we on such a great trajectory? So for the last 5 years, if you owned real estate and if you had a substantial 401k plan, you came out a winner. But at least half of Americans don't own real estate and don't have a substantial 401k plan. In fact, the majority of Americans do not. And they came out as a loser from the last 5 years of the economy. So we had the mainstream media, the elite media, the elites puzzled about the economy. And why do regular Americans say the economy sucks, and yet the experts say the economy is doing great? Why are the people so stupid as to not recognize that the economy is great? And our elites and our elite media and our elite politicians were angry at the public's failure to register how great the economy really is. And the elites would blame right-wing disinformation for conning voters into believing preposterous narratives about America's economic decline. And so it's important, I think, to take these divergent experiences on a case-by-case basis and not automatically assume that the people are wrong, and don't automatically assume that the elites are wrong. So what's really going on? And so we have this unemployment number of 4%, and that counts anyone as employed, even a homeless person who does an odd job or two, right? They are counted as employed, right? So Democrats overwhelmingly were much more inclined to believe what the official economic indicators reported about inflation, about employment. Republicans were much more inclined to believe what they were seeing with their own two eyes. So I'm not someone who holds that common sense is and firsthand experience is just far more reliable than expertise, right? In some circumstances it is, and some circumstances it is not. So I try to take these things on a case-by-case basis. So in this case, Republicans, average Americans, were much more clued in to the true state of the economy than the experts. So we have a small cohort of federal agencies that report economic statistics. But just because a government agency says something and releases a statistic does not mean that it strongly correlates with truth. Right? There are circumstances where official government pronouncements and statistics correlate with truth, and there are other circumstances where government statistics much more loosely correlate with truth. So the bottom line is, for 20 years or more, including the months prior to the election, voter perception was far more reflective of reality than government statistics. Now, there are going to be other circumstances where public perceptions are less reflective of reality than expert opinions. So I don't want to fall on either side of this divide. So take unemployment, right? Our record low unemployment number misleads in many ways. First, it counts as fully employed the millions of people who are unwillingly underemployed, right? People who work only a few hours each week while they're searching for a full-time job. Second, it does not take into account millions of Americans who have been so discouraged that they no longer try to get a job. And it does not take into account the meagerness of any individual's income. So you can be homeless, living on the streets, making an intermittent income, be incapable of keeping your family fed, and the government counts you as employed. So if you look at these statistics and revise them to understand how they are distorted, right, you'll recognize that the real unemployment rate is about 24%, right? About 1 in 4 American workers is functionally unemployed today, right? That's hardly something to celebrate, right? Weekly earnings, right? That only tracks full-time wages. It doesn't track the wages of those who counted as employed. Does not track the wages who are homeless and just doing odd jobs. So these official government statistics tell us that the median wage in America stands at $62,000. But if you track everyone in the workforce, part-time workers, unemployed job seekers, right, the median wage is about $52,000. Right? American workers on the median are making 16% less than prevailing statistics indicate.
Like we just talked about, I think there are some big problems. I mean, Freeberg just laid out the way in which trade with China is non-reciprocal. Like our companies cannot participate in their markets the same way that they can participate in ours. But it's worse than that. Like I talked about, these WTO rules gave China the opportunity to strategically annihilate our core industries that are critical in the supply chain. And there's one other piece of this which I think is really important, which is the race to the bottom. I mean, if you're an American company and you are still producing in America and your competitor is able to go to China and undercut you, obviously you have to do the same thing because, I mean, those are just the rules of the game. And so we've had this race to the bottom where if you're an American company operating under these rules, you have no choice.
It's worse.
But to export your manufacturing, your supply chains. So, we've had these rules that, again, under the status quo, I would say they're not free trade. It's unfair trade. It has all these perverse consequences. It's bad for middle America and this manufacturing belt of the country. And it's created massive strategic dependencies on an American adversary.
I'll say 3 things. Let me just say 3 things quickly. Number 1, I think Ken is massively long Pax America. I mean, he's built a $42 billion.
Okay, so everyone deserves some skepticism, right? Government, and also the claims of populists, the claims of Republicans, right? We all benefit from accurate criticism. Okay, think about a prominent issue from the 2024 campaign, inflation. So Democrats spent the campaign saying that inflation was no longer a problem. And let it be noted that I was highly skeptical in 2020 into 2021 that inflation would become a big deal, and I was wrong. Inflation became a much bigger deal than I expected. But our consumer price index perceives reality through a rosy-looking glass, right? Those with modest incomes purchase only a fraction of the 80,000 goods that the CPI tracks, and they spend a much greater share of their earnings on basics like groceries, healthcare, and rent. So if prices for eggs, insurance premiums, and apartment leases rise at a much faster clip than those of luxury goods and second homes, right, the CPI underestimates the impact of inflation on the bulk of Americans. And that's exactly what happened, right? So for Americans with modest incomes, right, inflation since 2001 has risen 35% faster than the official consumer price index. Right, the resources required simply to maintain the same working class lifestyle over the last 2 decades have risen more than 1/3 faster than we've been led to believe. Right, your average American was financially worse off over the last 5 years. Now, in 2023, the official CPI indicated that inflation was only 4.1%, but the true cost of living was more than twice that. It was 9.4% for working class Americans, right? So Democrats and elites and officials told us that wage gains outpaced inflation in the crisis following COVID. But that's not true, right? During 2023, if your average American purchasing power, average working American purchasing power fell at the median by 4.3%. So reality was drastically more dire for the great majority of Americans than official statistics indicated, than what our elites and elite media told us. So the elites, the elite media, and Democrats were telling us why are Americans so stupid as to not recognize what a fantastic economy we have, and why isn't the Biden administration doing a better job of selling its economic accomplishments? But the Biden administration did not have economic accomplishments for the vast majority of Americans. The vast majority of Americans were financially hurt by the Biden administration. And in 2023, all right, they went backwards on the median average by 4.3%. So Americans with bachelor's and more advanced degrees have since 2013 seen their material well-being improve. Those without high school degrees have seen no improvement or are falling behind. So we have a whole bunch of economic indicators that all point in the same misleading direction. They all shroud the reality faced by the overwhelming majority of Americans. Right? Some Americans came out financially ahead after 4 years of Bidenomics. But the majority of Americans, the lowest 60% of American income earners, did not. So don't just trust the experts, and don't just distrust the experts, but dig into the basis of, say, elite claims.
Billion-dollar empire. He owns $1 billion of American real estate. So I don't see him investing in Ecuador anytime soon relative to the opportunity set in the United States. And I think that's what speaks to the second point, which is investing is always a relative exercise. On Wednesday, I had a meeting with a Brazilian multi-decabillionaire, very, very, very successful guy. And we were talking about the tariffs and the investing posture. And he's like, there's still no other country other than America that I can really put my money to work in that makes any sense. And I kind of pushed him. What about China? What about India? And in all of these markets, there are, as Freeberg mentioned, vagaries in China. There's different problems in India. There's different problems in these other markets. Europe is roughly uninvestable. So the more generalized answer is on a relative basis, the United States is still the shining beacon on a hill. There is no investable alternative for scaled capital except the US. The last thing I want to say is just to build on what Zach said. Andrew, the thing that we keep forgetting is when economic leverage spills over to political leverage, what happens to the United States? And specifically what happened this week was on the rare earth side, not only did China constrain rare earths into the supply chain, what they then did was tell South Korea what they could do with the rare earths that they gave them. And now all of a sudden you have this geopolitical spillover where it's not just a country constraining supply, it's a country now dictating the political and trade practices of another country. So let me ask you a question. How do you think America is in the best position to make its own decisions? For example,
right. So people understand the ethical obligations of the doctor. They're overwhelmingly to the patient, but the ethical obligations of the journalist are incredibly diffused. And so economists are nearly universally opposed to tariffs, but how much deference should we give the expertise of economics with regard to tariffs, given that there are so many variables outside the realm of economics, right? Here's my point. There are too many variables with global trade for any one academic discipline or any one individual to be an expert, right? There are just so many variables. There are supply chains, there are currency fluctuations, there are geopolitical tensions, there are labor costs, there are environmental regulations, there's consumer demand, there are national security considerations, right? Expertise is going to be specialized, right? So you'll have economists focusing on trade theory and comparative advantage. You'll have logistical experts focusing on supply chains. You'll have lawyers dissecting World Trade Organization rules, right? No one individual can grasp every important variable here, right? Medicine and economics are not sciences. They do not deserve the prestige that comes to science. We accord great prestige to science because it's proven to be so useful. But even though economics and medicine use scientific methods, their disciplines overall are not scientific disciplines. They just contain elements of science. So economists do not have a great track record predicting national economic futures, right? Because there are so many variables, right? How much deference should we give economic predictions or global warming predictions, say for 5-10 years from now? There are so many variables that we don't accord these predictions great respect. And another thing that causes non-elites and non-leftists skepticism about many elite claims is when the elite claims and the elite predictions accord with pre-existing elite and left-wing desires. So, for example, there is a major opinion difference between elites in the United States and regular people with regard to free speech. Elites want much more regulation and much more suppression of free speech, and they want much more deference to expertise than regular Americans. Regular Americans don't want limitations on free speech, but American elites dramatically, by dramatic numbers, do. And so why is it that the people making the case for global warming end up at the same place that the left desires, even if there was no such thing as global warming? Right? The further left you go, the more you have rule by experts. Communism means rule by experts in the name of the people. Socialism means much more rule by experts than a free market approach. Right? Socialism and communism, when you start going significantly towards the left, it means rule by experts. And so the global warming crowd just so happens to want the same thing that experts and the left want, even if there was no such thing as global warming. They want expert rule. They want increased limitations on individual choice, such as whether or not to drive a car. Right? They want much more elite regulation of our lives, and they want to accord the individual far fewer choices in life. And so when the experts in one particular area, such as global warming, just so happen to prescribe the exact same policy prescriptions that they would push for, even if there was no such thing as global warming, that to me is a cause for some skepticism. So economists are not famed for the reliability of their predictions because there are so many variables and they interact so chaotically. Right? It's not that economists are entirely clueless, right? They're better than nothing, but think about weather predictions, right? It's better than nothing, but it's certainly far from 100%, right? And Grok largely agrees with me. Global warming, like macroeconomics and global trade, is a domain with an overwhelming number of variables interacting chaotically, and that makes comprehensive expertise by a single person or even a single academic discipline impossible. Right? The climate has intricate and chaotic interactions across atmospheric chemistry, ocean currents, land use, biological feedbacks, human activity, right? Each with its own subfields and uncertainties. Right? So many variables with so chaotic an interaction between them that no one person can, or no one academic discipline can claim convincing expertise in the overall project of climate change or in the overall project of global trade. Right? What's the track record of global warming experts and their predictions? Right? It's quite mixed because we have great complexity when it comes to climate. We have all these countless chaotic interacting variables: atmospheric chemistry, ocean currents, human emissions, feedback loops. So there are some areas where we should give expertise great deference, and then there are other areas where we should have considerable skepticism. Right? If the experts are right with regard to Trump's tariffs, and all the experts seem to be pretty much unanimous that Trump's tariffs are terrible, then why is Wall Street only down 7% from its all-time record highs earlier this year? Right? If Trump is such an idiot, such a buffoon, such a disaster, then why are the bond markets and the stock markets only falling towards a modest level? Right? Science has enormous prestige because it is useful. Economics and medicine are not sciences. Therefore, they do not deserve the prestige that we accord to science. Science gets prestige from its ability to predict, to produce reliable, testable, and transformative results, predictive and explanatory power. Right? That's what we accord science. Right? Economics straddles science and social science. It uses mathematical models and statistical tools and empirical data, but it's not a science. Right? Medicine has some scientific claims rooted in biology, chemistry, and physiology. It has some randomized controlled trials, but medicine has so many variables. It's so complex. Right? There's the variability between different groups of people and different individuals. There are ethical limits on experiments. There are evolving diseases. Right? It does not have the precision of physics. Right? Both medicine and economics apply scientific tools, but they are far messier than the hard sciences. Right? Economics must contend with human behavior, medicine with biological diversity. And so they do not deserve the prestige that we accord to science.
Example, let's say that there's a China-Taiwan situation and we need to decide one way or the other. And I'm not saying which way is right or wrong, but for the purposes of this, the thought exercise is China and Taiwan get into some spat. We have to take a side. And China says, we're going to constrain all the pharmaceutical APIs into the supply chain. We're going to constrain all the battery cathode into the supply chain. And we're going to constrain all of the rare earths to anyone who doesn't take our side. Now, how is America in a position to actually decide for ourselves what is in our best interests if that's looming over us? And I think that this is the big problem that this is exposed. This rush to globalism, the race to the bottom, has actually created a level of dependence that doesn't allow you to do what's in your best interest.
So, real quick, I agree with you in so many ways.
So much of the way that I understand the world is auditory. Right? I place a great deal of emphasis on listening. And so when Kemedov notes that my volume is low, he's not just putting his finger on a technical malfunction with my show, right? A lack of precision and proper amount of care for my listener. What happens is that I start my show with an enormous amount of energy and I keep peaking into the red. Right? I'm blowing out my volume in the beginning of the show when I'm just filled with energy and excitement. Now I'm almost 2 hours into the show